There we go. We're back. Good. Now, so I borrowed this from Roxana Majeska's slide from an earlier talk because I'm not a scholar of diatoms. I studied people who studied algae from 1880 to 1930. And so it was really helpful for me listening to her talk to hear at the beginning what diatoms are, and they are unicellular microalgae. And the people that I studied algae, both microalgae and macroalgae. And mostly they were looking at both freshwater and marine algae, but mostly marine algae. And so I'm a historian of science, and so I am thinking about the cultural, social settings that science is taking place in and who the scientists are. So I think it's really interesting that so many different disciplines study diatoms, from biology and geology to cell biology, nanotechnology, taxonomy, and biogeochemistry. So the people, oh my gosh, here we go. I just clicked on the screen. To give you an idea of the setting from 1880 to 1930 of who was getting to study science. This is a picture of the unveiling of the Charles Darwin statue in London at the Natural History Museum, the British Museum of Natural History. And you can see it's largely men. This is what science looks at like when you look at histories of institutions, or if you look at people who published and were well known in their time, is you might think that it's only men. But incidentally, if you look for women, you will find them. And so that's what happened. And during this time period at this British Museum of Natural History, one of the historical figures that I look at, who was corresponding with my major figure, Anna Weber-van Bosse, was working here at the British Museum of Natural History in the algae section. Just have to click. Okay, so I was telling Sarah about this a little bit, but how I got into this is I was coming at it from looking into the history of ocean science and the history of marine biology, and the history of evolutionary biology. And I wanted to study women in science. So my professor suggested looking at Anna Weber-van Bosse, who's a Dutch algologist. She was pretty well known even in her time. She was the first woman to receive an honorary doctorate in the Netherlands. That happened in 1910. So she is well known in her time for her work on algae. She published it in both on research and guides for other algologists. She was also the first woman to go on an oceanographic expedition, and oceanographic expeditions are more likely to exclude women because of the material realities of the ship in terms of bathrooms and bedrooms. So she was the first woman to be included as a scientist on the oceanographic expedition, the Saboga expedition. So she's well known and had an archive in the Netherlands, and that's where I started. And I was thinking about studying her contributions to symbiosis because she wrote on symbiosis of algae in sloth fur and also in sponges and on coral reefs, not microalgae, but macroalgae and filamentous algae. But so something that the Dutch did in the 1880s is to try to find their brightest students. They would pose these questions to you pose a question, a research question, and then they pick the prize-winning paper. So this is a paper that Anna Weber-van Bosse wrote as a response to a question about the biological, taxonomic, and the word in Dutch or French is organographic study of the algae that live in sloth fur. And so she titled it, she's calling these the algae parasitic, because at the time that was the overall default framework for understanding how two distinct living things would live together and the nature of how they live together. So there were a number of experimental botanists in the 1860s who were talking about lichen and how it was, rather than being an individual organism, it was actually made of both a fungus and an algae. And there was a lot of discussion as to the nature of this relationship. And one scientist suggested it was like a master-slave relationship where one benefits and it's a negative for the other one. Not everyone necessarily agreed with that characterization, but the overarching paradigm for the time was to talk about these relationships as parasitic. So here she's calling the algae an algal parasite of sloth fur. And even though she calls it a parasite, this is my translation of her paper where she's talking about how the algae lives in the sloth fur. So she doesn't describe it as necessarily hyper negative, but she says, our algae cling to these cracks. They find between them, the cortical cells, what they need to live, namely a point of attachment, sufficient light and humidity, for the sloths live in the virgin forests of America, where there's a warm atmosphere and always full of vapors. The algae multiply enormously under such favorable conditions. I'm gonna click here. So that's one of her claim to fame. I'm giving you a little backdrop of why people know about her initially. So the other one is being the algologist on the Saboga expedition. And the reason that she got to be included on the Saboga expedition is because she was married to Max Carl Wilhelm Weber. That's the guy here in the back next to Anna Weber-van Bosse. And she met him. He's actually her second husband. Her first husband passed away, and after that is when she pursued attending university. She attended the University of Amsterdam as a special student. Women weren't fully allowed to be fully enrolled degree-winning students at this point, even though there were a number of women. There was a marked increase in the women pursuing education and in science in the second half of the 1800s. Around the world, in the US and in Europe, and different countries had different timelines. So it wasn't everyone all at once, but there was a marked increase. And so she studied botany from 1880 to 1883 in Amsterdam. And that's where she met Max Carl Wilhelm Weber, where he was a zoology professor. She took classes with Hugo de Vries, who was a plant physiologist. And this was before he became known as one of the rediscoverers of Mendel's laws of inheritance. But there were interesting things that they had to go through as women special students. They weren't allowed to enter the lecture hall until the professor got there. They had to conduct their research in their lab work in a separate lab room. So it wasn't entirely equal, but they were all happy to be there. A note about who got to be there. So Anna Weber-van Bosse is from a wealthy family. She was Anna van Bosse at this point in Amsterdam. So she's utilizing her wealth. And then she also became more wealthy as a widow from her first husband. And that's pretty normal for women who are able to conduct careers in science at this point in the 19th century, is that they have family connections and wealth. And then another strategy that they use is if they're married to a scientist. So she marries Weber, and just want to note, this is not the same Max Weber who creates the field of sociology. That's why he goes by Max Carl Wilhelm Weber. Anyway, so he's a zoologist, and biogeography is of interest to many at the time. And so, and the Dutch are controlling the Netherlands East Indies, which up until 1900 was really mostly Java, which is the most populated island in what we now call Indonesia. But through marriage to Weber, Weber-van Bosse was able to start amassing a massive collection of algae that she collected in Norway when they went to Norway, Trondheim, which is where Weber was collecting whales and fish. He was a comparative anatomist, so he was mostly vertebrates, but he was interested in all sorts of animals. So she was collecting algae there. They went to the East Indies in 1889 to 1990, and then they went again on the Saboga expedition, which was 1899, so 10 years later, to 1900. And the track here shows where they go around, and they were on a naval ship. So the Netherlands was interested in measuring the depths of the sea, as well as demonstrating their colonial reach. And for context, the British expedition, the Challenger, went through this area and conducted some deep sea cores just about a decade earlier. So there's some imperial politics going on in the backdrop for how this publication or this expedition got funded and allowed her to go. It's also unique that a botanist would be included as a scientist on an expedition. And again, it's probably because of her marriage, but probably also because the Netherlands as an imperial power was well known for their botanical station in Java. It was the Estlands Buitenzorg, which is at the time was run by someone named Melchior Trube. And it was such an important station, and many scientists and experimental botanists went there to conduct research both on agricultural products, but also experimental botany. And so I think that's part of why it's important that it's a Dutch expedition, that Anna Weber-van Bosse got to go on an oceanographic expedition to study the algae of the shallow and deep seas. So this is the Saboga ship. So you can see how massive of a ship it is. And then they had material for collecting samples and doing coring samples. And the large part of the collections that they did, they sent back to be examined and analyzed by experts around the world. So the Saboga Expedition monograph series, the last one was finally published in 1986. So it's this massive publication. And there's also I will say it's a large number of women who are involved in the publications of the Saboga materials. And the image of the green algae is just an example of some of the macroalgae that Anna Weber-van Bosse wrote about. So these are mostly taxonomic treatises on naming species that they found in the Netherlands, East Indies. And she was a specialist of macroalgae in Caulerpa. I don't know if that's how you say that, but another interesting thing about her that is relevant for women algologists is she was involved in a national exhibition of women's work that was in The Hague in 1998. And so she displayed some of her algae collections, like as I have pictured here. So to demonstrate her support of demonstrating how women were participating in science and the workforce, and they were pushing for women's rights activists were pushing for the right to vote. But also they were pushing for things like being able to read in public. Something this group that put this on was involved with was setting up a reading museum, a place where women could read books because they weren't allowed to read books in public. So she was involved in that, and there's overlap in the women's rights activists and Anna Weber-van Bosse, although there's also some complicating factors in how she wrote about women in science later on in her work. But incidentally, one of the women who sent her sloths from Suriname for her to be able to conduct the research on algae and sloth fur was a freethinker and a feminist who was involved in this work and was in Suriname as a governess, and sent her both living and dead sloth samples so that she could have better research. So by looking at Anna Weber-van Bosse's archive, which is where I started, I discovered not only women who were working on the specimens from the Saboga expedition, but also a large number of women who were corresponding with her and 4 men also, who were algologists around the world. So I determined that there's a self-organized feminist algology network. So pictured here, we have Anna Weber-van Bosse sitting in the chair with the glasses. And she's my central node of the network because that's how I accessed all these other people. So her letters to her, many of the letters from algologists around the world were asking for samples to exchange. And so that's a fairly common practice in natural history. For example, Darwin did a lot of this. He had a large correspondence network. But what's different about these 8 people in her correspondence network is that they were really supporting each other in their careers and in their research in ways that shows this bottom-up organization of doing science. This happening sort of adjacent to and sometimes within institutions of science. So I'll tell you a little bit more about each person. So the man right here next to Anna Weber-van Bosse is Edouard Bornet. He's a French algologist. He worked with Thuret, who was a wealthy amateur, and then became sort of the head of algology in France. And he lived right next to the Botanique Libraire de Botanique in Paris. And so that was a place where a lot of people went, and he acted as a mentor to many of the women here, Anna Weber-van Bosse, Anna Vickers, who's just on the other side of Bornet. And so she's another independently wealthy, this time a single woman who she was born in France. Her parents were British, but they lived kind of all over. But she is someone who lived and died in Roscoff, France. And I talk a lot about her and her algological work in the paper that has the same title as this talk, because she was studying algae on the seaside and sort of had enough property to create a marine station for women who were visiting Roscoff. And the Marine Biological Station of Roscoff, even though it accepted many women students and researchers, they didn't provide housing for women scientists. So they had to find their own housing. And so Anna Vickers was essential in that. And then this is Marshall Avery Howe. So he was associated with the New York Botanical Gardens, and he got a PhD. He's American, working in institutions of science. This is Ethel Barton Gepp. She's first Ethel Barton and then later becomes Ethel Barton Gepp. She publishes as both. She is the algologist who worked at the British Museum of Natural History, and unpaid, but in the algae section. And she's a specialist on Halimeda, and also was acknowledged as an important person, a knowledgeable scientist who was working on algae in her time period, even though she mostly gets erased. But she was the British scientist that British expeditions sent their algological samples to be determined what they are and write up treatises. So the coral drilling expeditions that the British undertook in the Pacific in the late 1890s, she was the one. And then the sea lark expeditions to the Indian Ocean, she was doing all their algological determinations. So she's within an institution of science, but they had zero about her in their archives. So she was erased. On the bottom here is William Albert Setchell, who also a well-known algologist who was based at Berkeley. And he did a lot of work on kelp, but many types of algae, and was involved in the US group, the coalition, or that kind of rewrote the definition of coral reefs as symbiotic entities in the 1920s. And he corresponds with Anna Weber-van Bosse quite frequently. And he visits her in Holland. They lived in Eerbeek after about 1900. And then this is Mikael Foslie. He's a Norwegian algologist, also well known, writing a lot about coralline algae. He got his start as an amateur, but then became fully employed at a museum in Trondheim. And then I don't have any pictures of Natalie Karsakoff, but this is the gravesite of Paul Karsakoff and Helen Karsakoff, who are her younger brother and sister. And this is in Roscoff. And the land here that this cemetery is at is right next to the Station Biologique de Roscoff, and it's land that Anna Vickers used to own. And so when the Karsakoff went during the summer to conduct research in Roscoff, she would bring her family with her most of the time, and she sometimes her mom helped her, which was also common for other single women conducting algological studies, especially when they were traveling, because the rules of propriety meant that single women couldn't travel by themselves. And so Karsakoff and Weber-van Bosse were also very close, and I can say more about them later. And so I want to give you the background for the self-organized network. So in history of science, there are often a tendency to look at top-down organizations. And so this idea of a self-organized network comes from a historian of early modern science who was saying, in contrast to thinking about both imperial power and religious power, for the reason that science made progress or moved forward or was producing knowledge about nature, is there are also, and here's the quote, flows of knowledge were not only guided by coordinating forces from above, whether of an imperial, commercial, or religious nature, but also by forces from below, which could show a degree of regularity, but did not betray a high measure of control. This bottom-up process may be called self-organization, and this refers to the emergence of patterns through numerous interactions among individual entities without any form of direct centralized control. So my algological network I'm calling a self-organized network because there's no top-down control. There's sort of a lot of repeated interactions among the 8 algologists from the previous slide, and they're supporting each other on their algological research. And so here again are the women from that group. We have Weber-van Bosse, Barton Gepp, Vickers, and Karsakoff. And in the paper about the Station Biologique de Roscoff, there's letters among them. So it's not only just of Weber-van Bosse, but there's also letters among them. So Vickers and Karsakoff are working together in Roscoff. At one point, Karsakoff and Barton are working together. They meet up on some travels. Barton had some illness that meant she had to go to seaside or the mountains, and Karsakoff met up with her. And there are also some other marine stations that Vickers had connections with. So the marine station at Naples, and I think they planned for Barton to go to Naples and stay with Vickers' sister. So they're talking to each other about their specimens, their research, and sending papers and books and samples, sometimes asking for help on identification, often commiserating on struggles, and overall, their social relationships are friendships that you might find in a lab or in institutions with a physical barrier or boundaries, but that they're creating sort of outside of, connected with institutions of science. It's not only algologists that are supported by these connections. And so this is bringing in women who are working on the Saboga expedition collections, and that Weber and Weber-van Bosse are supporting at the University of Amsterdam, but this is just to show you how they're connected to Weber-van Bosse, but also each other. So the new people on this slide are, this is Mia Boisseven, who she did her PhD in Zurich on some sort of mollusk. The Sabuga expedition monograph that she wrote up was on the elephant tusk mollusk shells. So she was a student of Weber of zoology, and she also corresponded with Weber-van Bosse. She helped to unpack and organize, so was employed by the Museum of the University of Amsterdam to process the Sabuga expedition materials. So that's Mia Boisseven. And then here at the bottom is Minnie Reed, who was an American algologist who traveled to Europe. She was a student of William Albert Setchell at Berkeley, and then she traveled to Europe to conduct research. She, I think, spent a month at the Naples station, where the Naples station was a biological station that was only research. It didn't have courses. And so sometimes women's participation in science is sort of stratified by the hierarchy of research is the most important, right? And then teaching and education is not quite as, obviously this is not true. It's just the, how sometimes things are approached. And so she was at the Naples station, and there were fewer women at the Naples station because it was research only and didn't have any coursework. In contrast, the Marine Biological Station of Roscoff had courses as well as opportunities for conducting research. So there were more women who enrolled as students at that station. So she's a student of Setchell, and she goes to visit Weber-van Bosse and Hugo de Vries, and conduct some research in Germany also. So there's this education network of support, mentorship, just like you might see in a university setting, with many connected to these women. I'm also contrasting Weber-van Bosse and the other women to maybe more well-known women who studied seaweed and wrote about seaweed and algology, like Margaret Gatty, who is characterized as an amateur in that she collected seaweed but also worked with and sent her samples to established men of science, like W.H. Harvey. So she's also writing books about teaching for children. And so in contrast to British women who collected seaweed and were also interested in writing about seaweed, Anna Weber-van Bosse and the network were fully considered themselves research scientists and conducting careers in research and algology, and would not characterize themselves as amateur, even though it's not bad to be an amateur, and it's not always monolithic, and that Vickers was considered an amateur by Karsakoff, but Karsakoff considered herself a research scientist. So back to Weber-van Bosse and her work, and I started, and I'll wrap this up with so we have the social aspect of women doing science and algology being slightly more open to women, and having a botanist on an oceanographic expedition, and women supporting other women in their self-organized network, and also working with men scientists. So they're fully integrated in the algological exchange network of algologists doing research on doing their science. And through that, I see I think there's a shift demonstrated in the publications for Weber-van Bosse on how she talks about how living things like the algae on sloth fur live together and what the nature of that relationship is. And so she has a changing perspective based on her lived experience. So from the first trip to the Netherlands East Indies, which was more overland. Of course, they were on ships because it's an archipelago, but it was mostly on land. And so she co-wrote some examinations of symbiosis of algae and sponges with Weber, her husband. And they talk about 3 groups of symbiosis between animals and plants. They talk about the green unicellular green algae with animals, unicellular yellow algae, and then symbiosis with algae of a higher organization. And that here she mentions parasitism again, but they're talking about, and this image shows the filamentous algae, which I'll talk more about. So not unicellular. And what she says about it, or what they say about it, is that the sponge, here's the quote, has therefore influenced the algae so much that it has lost its branching and was limited to developing tubular filaments. However, apart from that, it cannot be said that the algae suffers from the sponge's influence. So I'm going to skip down to the last sentence, and it says, this makes us conclude that the algae lives in symbiosis with the sponge, and that in the case now, we could not call it parasitism. So I think she has this changing understanding of how species are living together, and doesn't want to call it parasitism, point blank. And so here again, they say, it is clear that you cannot bet on parasitism every time you meet an algae and a sponge. We keep this expression for cases in which the association is intimate and wrongs one or both organism while the other benefits. She also notices some cases of symbiosis in the noctilucas in bioluminescence. And so, and then again, they call it symbiosis rather than parasitism. I'm gonna, the video is playing. That's fine. That's, yes, I'm gonna try to skip ahead. So I'm gonna skip through these. These are just more information, or Karsakoff, who was Russian and lived from 1863 to 1941. She spent 12 summers conducting research at Roscoff on algae and wrote about brown algae living in an epiphytic relationship. And this is more in the paper in the Journal of History of Biology. And again, is thinking that, I think along the lines of, it's not always detrimental for one species. So there's more of an understanding of a benign coexistence rather than a negative effect on one species versus the other. Karsakoff stopped, where I found nothing from Karsakoff after 1904, at which point she had gone to volunteer with the Red Cross in Russia. So her career kind of stops there. But I did find that she didn't pass away until 1941. So she lived a long life and was a highly engaging writer, correspondence. This is Vickers. She died in 1906. This is the image. The postcard shows Roscoff from the 1980s, but the main buildings here are the Marine Station, Station Biologique de Roscoff. So this is the library is in this building right here, and here's the church square, and you see this little red star in the turret. This is Vickers' home, and she owned 2 because she bought one for cheap from a close friend of hers. So they're really right across the square from this marine station, which was a very bustling social hub for experimental science, and remains so. And so it's truly remarkable that she was able to provide the same sort of material access to conduct research for women algologists. And you'll have to read the paper, and I have a copy if you need it, where I lay that out a little bit more, but the proximity is striking. And the cemetery is over here on this side, where Karsakoff's 2 siblings are buried. Barton Gepp, she did continue to publish with her husband Gepp, who was employed as the, I forget the British terms, but she at the British Museum, but again, unpaid and sort of written out of history. But she was an important part of the network, doing science or doing work on algae. And then the last thing, which I think is from Weber-van Bosse, coincidentally, it's about 8 individuals that she notices, and this is published in 1901. And she says the flora, it's a dinoflagellate, that there was somebody else, a different scientist who wasn't there, considered each of the little hammer-shaped things to be the individual. But Weber-van Bosse said, no, it's actually composed of these 8 individuals together, and that's the formation. So she said, the flora of the Malay archipelago is rich in genres and species, but my attention has been above all captivated by a star formed by 8 individuals. And then also writing about her work with her husband, she used the term symbiosis as a good motto for their happy union. And that was in a description that she sent to a British scientist who was writing a obituary of Weber in 1937. So I think her own self-consciousness of the work that she did with women scientists and with her husband in algae, and how it shaped how she saw, she interpreted the laws of nature. And there's the network again. So I'll end there. Thank you. And I'll welcome any questions about this talk or about the paper if you read the paper before. And I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, that's just some engrams. I'll go back. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. I'm really curious about the differences in language, and maybe Marina and Anna can feed in. I mean, you're talking mostly about French, British, Dutch, Norwegian, some Americans, or this network?
A couple, the 2 American men come in after 1900.
And are they mostly speaking French, or are they speaking English,
So
or going?
Weber-van Bosse mostly, well, she was publishing in French initially, French and Dutch, and then wrote to French and English are most of the letters that I was looking at between Karsakoff and Weber-van Bosse and Vickers. They were French, English with Mikael Foslie, Setchell, and Gepp. So she could write and publish in all of them. But so French was the language of publication. So like the sloth paper was published in French, the language of science.
Yeah, I'm curious about how these lines progress, because there's kind of a German lineage, especially within the diatoms, which there were not women involved in that. And then there's Russia and other Slavic countries where there was another sort of lineage and very strong role of women. And just if they didn't really merge, if they're all sort of advancing somewhat independently.
Yeah, well, so the German point, that's a good point. There were a lot of other Germans working on algae, and there was a German guy that Foslie really didn't like, and he complained about him to Weber-van Bosse, and there were a number of German scientists or algologists who were corresponding with Weber-van Bosse in German. I don't read German, so I didn't include them in this, but also it was there, like you said, there weren't women Germans, as far as I know.
At least they got any credit. They were
Right.
they were there doing work as their highly skilled technicians, but not being recognized in any.
But so many women in places like Germany and the UK, which were a little bit behind in allowing women to enter into university, went to Paris or went to Zurich for their PhD or their studies, and then got connected. But actually, so the article on the Roscoff Marine Station, there is a huge number of Russian women students who attended. So many of the pictures that they have, they'll say like Mademoiselle Kamencho, or and so they're Slavic sounding names that they don't always have first and last names, but and there's a zoologist, a Russian zoologist, who is conducting research formally at the Marine Station Biologique de Roscoff, but not an algologist. And there's a bias towards zoology at the Roscoff station. But yes, there are a number of women from Russia and there.
Well, anybody else, if you have a question, you can chime in or put it in the chat or whatever you'd like to do.
I was really shocked to hear that women in Netherlands were prohibited from reading in public.
Yes, isn't that insane?
Is it just Netherlands, or is it just like all over Europe? Like,
I think that each country had sort of its own rules. And the Netherlands had their interesting sort of pillar system that was connected. There's like the Catholic groups and then the Lutheran groups. And so I think they had some different social proprietary or proper social etiquette that was unique to the Netherlands. But yeah, there was this group of 8 women said, here's the first reading place for women to be able to read in public. I'm sure they just weren't allowed in libraries. They also weren't allowed to ride horses in Amsterdam. So there were some strange rules. Yeah, I will say I'm seeing this picture of Cam Craft, your photo. So Roscoff seemed like a place, like a heaven for algologists, because the way the bay was shaped, and the tide, and because it's the part of France, the Brittany region of France, in the Channel. So the way that the temperatures and the places, the different meeting points of algal flora from both the north and the south. So there was a huge amount of biodiversity. And then the way the tide went out is that you could collect algae like this. And the town, I read somewhere that it was a punishment for students in class, like elementary school students, to have to go collect algae and put it on the horse carts. So it was such hard work. But you could buy pickled algae to eat and sorts of interesting algal stuff.
Leila, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Emily, for this talk. Oh, I don't know if you hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, and indeed for Roscoff, it's a very pretty place, and the tide is really big. So for algae, it's perfect. And just a word for Sarah, because she asked about American, but you mentioned Minnie Reed from America, who was working in Naples. Is it? What was in Naples at that period?
Yes, Naples has the experimental. It was the first formal marine station, biological research station, set up by a Prussian guy in Naples. And the American Association of Women they would pay for a table so that one woman, often a student at one of the Seven Sisters colleges, could attend and do research in Naples, which was a big career boost, right? You meet people at stations and you learn new techniques, and you're so close to your stuff that you're using in your experiments that you can have a lot of productivity. So Minnie Reed was at the Naples station, which was primarily zoology at the time, but they also had people like Minnie Reed. And then she went on to, she lived in Hawaii and was collecting algae in Hawaii. But so she had just done a master's, and yeah, so
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry for my video. I didn't, I wasn't able to put it.
Oh,
So,
No worries.
so
Glad you could join again, Leila.
yeah, thanks.
I really appreciated the question that you began with of who gets to study science and where. And yeah, I'm really convinced that that having these different perspectives makes a big difference on what it is that the outcome of the science. I mean, you know, hinted at that quite a bit through symbiosis, you know, how that comes into being because of who's looking at it and who's interpreting it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not like you're not born as a woman interpreting nature differently. It's the socialization and the cultural context that you are existing in that shapes how you view the world. That's my take. But I also, so I forgot to mention when you were asking about the Germans, if there's German people in the network or others. So the 8 people that I looked at, they were the ones that with the thickest files of correspondence between Weber-van Bosse, that she had their letters. So if someone sent one letter to her, it was less of a relationship, right? But there was a woman algologist, an American woman named Josephine Tilden, who was based out of Minnesota and created a station near Vancouver, right in the Pacific Northwest, and also had her mother go with her to help set up the station. And there were a number of women students who went to the station. But yeah, it's interesting because, you know, in your letters to people, there's a little bit of informality. So Setchell didn't think highly of Tilden. So the American guy at Berkeley didn't think highly of Tilden. And then there was also this very interesting correspondence between Setchell and Weber-van Bosse about Minnie Reed. And so this is when Weber-van Bosse is older and I don't know, just older, and Setchell's older, and she's a young student, and Weber-van Bosse was critical of her lack of focus, like she was doing all these different projects and not picking one thing to focus on. And then there's also some like when Minnie Reed went to go meet Hugo de Vries, they said, absolutely do not stay longer than 45 minutes. Like, don't overstay your welcome. And it's been written, other historians of science have written more about Hugo de Vries, but I think he was not very welcoming or friendly with women scientists. And Weber-van Bosse didn't experience that. And maybe it's because she was wealthy and connected to Weber. But one of the other students, when she was a special student at the University of Amsterdam, was Hugo de Vries's cousin. So it's highly.
It's remarkable. So you did most of this work through letters.
Yes.
It's remarkable that they were archived.
Yes. So I think the reason that they're archived is because Weber-van Bosse donated her massive herbarium collection to what at the time was a Rijksherbarium in the Netherlands, and now it's at the Naturalis Museum of Biodiversity. But they were all I'm sure stored together. But even when I went in 2017, I mean, they weren't organized. Nobody else has looked at them. There's somebody's written about Mikael Foslie, a Norwegian scholar, but yes, it's amazing that there's this woman scientist with a massive archive. And Setchell also has a very well-kept archive at Berkeley at the Jepson Herbarium.
There's a couple questions coming on the chat. Tom asks if any other networks have persisted over generations, for multiple generations.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, gosh, I kind of stopped at 1930, but I think there is some intergenerational shift going on. So sort of more between in the choral stuff. Stanley Gardner was involved in the coral drilling expeditions in the 1890s, and then the sea lark expedition in the East Indies. And he was a friend of Weber's, and he corresponded with, or he sent specimens to both Weber-van Bosse and Gepp, Ethel Barton Gepp. And then he helped organize this, the Great Barrier Reef expedition, which was a big coral reef, a year-long study of coral reef ecology and biology and zoology in Australia in 1930. And so, and a couple years before, there's Boschma, H. Boschma, who's a Dutch guy that is Weber's connected to. So Weber and Gardner have this sort of institutional ability to say, here's the next guy. I trained him, and here's the next guy to study this. But I think that because the women were not fully, they didn't have institutional legacies in terms of students as much. So I would say, no, there's probably not.
And Layla asks, who's the first woman diatomist?
Oh, good question.
Uh,
I don't know.
I was going to guess Marina and Anna. I was going to say
Yeah.
Ina Strelnikova was.
No.
No?
Astrid
Okay.
is
Astrid Cleveler.
Astrid Cleveler, thank you.
Oh yeah.
Wait,
Astrid-
Unless I'm missing somebody else, but that's the first name that comes to mind. you
Yes,
know.
of course.
And because she was a daughter of an outstanding datamist, you know that.
Yeah.
Hey, how about Clara Ehrenberg, who illustrated all Ehrenberg's stuff?
Yeah, she illustrated, but like the person who really like was.
Yeah, but that might be an example of,
I know that.
in Germany, women played a big role, but it was, as the assistant that was not recognized. That
And you could
persisted for
you
a
can
long
say
time.
that they're participated in science too, but I like the distinction, right? Like if you define yourself as a scientist or doing the research.
No, the big names in that research, of course, it's Astrid Cleveler and then our own Ruth Patrick. And both were influenced by their fathers.
Hmm.
That's how it's important to have a father, who is like really, that's a big influence. A lot of women scientists actually were influenced by their fathers.
Yes.
Emily, Marina is the curator of the diatom collection in Philadelphia that
Oh,
was
cool.
established by
Ruth
Ruth
Patrick.
Patrick
Okay.
very early on.
I'm going to look up these women that you named. So Astrid Cleaver, is that what you said? Her?
I'll put it in the
Yeah.
I'll send you an email. I'll send
Okay.
an email with some of those names. Yeah. How about, were there women, Russian women's before Nina?
There was José.
Jose?
Jose was probably the people. Shishukova Paretska. She was married to a diatomist Paretsky. So they were all. She worked in our department in St. Petersburg. Jose was working in Moscow. And I don't know. I don't remember like how she started.
Do you know if any of them have letters? Did any of them have archives that would have been? I always thought a film should have been made about Nina Strelnikova. She was a force.
Maybe in the family, but it's nothing is accessible right now.
And we don't write letters anymore. That has come to an end. Kind of an era there where that was possible.
Yeah, so that North European, Scandinavian, Russian datum tradition that came mostly from quaternary studies, like the glaciation, the history of the Baltic Sea. That's how datum research developed in that area.
There was a marine station and the Sebastopol, I think is that correct?
It's in Karadag in Crimea. Yeah, it's still there. There are a
Yeah.
couple of, as I understand, it's a couple of shacks on the beach, you know.
Oh, really? Yeah.
But
Maybe
there is an
we'll have an
institute,
archive
yeah,
then.
maybe.
Yeah.
Well, we've come to the top of the hour. So, Emily, I just really thank you so much for presenting in our series. It's been wonderful to have
Thanks
you
for
here
having
and
me.
learn about your work and
Thank
learn
you.
about the history. And everyone, thank you for joining. I'm always inspired by these gatherings, and it just keeps me going in these difficult times.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Reach out anytime. All right. Best regards. Bye-bye.